Welcome to the LeaderCast podcast, a weekly deep dive into the stories that transformed our guests into leaders worth following. I'm your host, Joe Boyd. If you've been enjoying the podcast, thank you so much for being a listener. One simple thing you can do to help us out is give a review wherever you listen. Today's guest is Dorie Clark. She is best known as being the author of the best-selling book called The Long Game. She graduated college at the age of 18. What were you doing when you were 18? I was barely graduating high school. You're going to love this whole conversation. She's amazing. I love her energy. And oh yeah, one more thing. She's writing a musical. You're going to want to know what that's about too. Dorie Clark, welcome to the LeaderCast podcast. We're super happy to have you.
I am thrilled to be here. Thank you so much.
I was reading your bio and getting to know you a little bit. I'm super excited just to talk to you about lots of things. But before we dive back in and, we'll get really deep and find out what kind of kid you were and how that influenced you. What are you mainly up to now? We know you're an author and other things, but if you meet someone in a bar or an elevator, what do you tell them you do these days?
Oh, well, I guess it depends whether I want to scare them off or not. If I do, I'm just like, I do consulting, that gets them gone. But generally I tell people I write I write business and career books and speak and consult about that. I also do a lot of work these days too in writing musicals, which is something that I have started 7 years ago and have as kind of a serious sideline that I pursue.
That's fun and awesome. And I could spend the whole podcast talking about that, but then people would say, is this a musical podcast? But maybe we'll get to it in a second. By the way, just side note, I'm a complete Hamilton nerd, and just so we could talk about that forever.
Yeah, how can you not be? Such good stuff.
I can't. We'll go on. I'm sorry. I'm making myself speechless on my own podcast. Let's go. Let's learn a little bit about yourself. I know at least your childhood sounds not typical as I read through it. So could you sort of explain what kind of kid were you? What were you into? What excited you early on? And I'd love to hear, it looks like you graduated high school pretty early. So I'd kind of love to hear how all that came about.
Yeah, I did graduate. Well, actually, I never graduated high school. So in a literal sense, I think I would technically be a high school dropout, but more accurate is just I stopped going and didn't go back. I grew up in a small town in North Carolina, and it was not really my place. I didn't really feel like I fit in very well, and I wanted to get out as soon as I could. And so I was researching a million different possibilities, but the one that seemed the most appealing to me was just to expedite things. Yeah. And so there was a program at Mary Baldwin College, now Mary Baldwin University in Virginia, which is a accelerated program basically for high school girls to enter college early. And so I thought that sounded like a splendid idea, and I managed to get in. So I started college when I was 14 and then just proceeded apace and ended up graduating. I did 2 years at Mary Baldwin, and then I transferred to Smith College in Massachusetts and finished that in when I was 18.
I'm going to date myself, maybe not you, but there's like Doogie Howser vibes, right? If you remember Doogie.
I do.
So he's 13 and
awesome.
He's in medical school with all the 24-year-olds. Was that a reality? Like, were there times where you were like a 14, 15 and you're surrounded by older folks at school?
To a certain extent. At Mary Baldwin, there was a cohort of people. So it wasn't just me. There were probably about 50 people who were in that situation. And, it was a reasonably small campus. So it's not like 50 people was, by any stretch a majority, but there was enough of a cohort. So it didn't feel like you were the only one.
Yeah.
Also, I had the advantage that, I looked old enough. Like I could have fit in. So it wasn't quite so obvious that I was younger. So that helps.
And are you looking back on it really happy about that path you took? Is there any regret that you didn't do kind of normal high school kind of stuff or anything like that?
the truth, Joe, is that high school's terrible.
Absolutely.
I mean, maybe not for everyone, but I'm gonna say for actually a lot of people, it's pretty terrible.
Yeah.
So no, I don't think I missed anything. I think at the time it was so funny because you'd always get these very concerned questions from
Yeah.
parents,
Yeah.
especially, and they'd be like, "Aren't you sad? You're missing your prom." They seem to fixate on that. I'm like, really? Is that the best you can do?
Yeah.
I mean, if that's the highlight, I really don't know. So, I mean, to me, the idea of actually getting to go to college and like start living
That was it.
was so much
I
better.
love that.
So, yeah, I feel 110% happy that I did that.
I did this 2-day life plan, which was phenomenal. It was like 8 years ago, and the whole first day is supposed to be about your past. The second day is about your future. And we talked about my 8th grade year for 3 hours. And finally, I was like, "Shouldn't we move on?" And he was like, "Nope."
What
He's like,
happened in eighth
it
grade,
was
man?
awful.
What was
It was
going on?
terrible. I moved to a new school. I had no friends. I was depressed and like just what he showed me is I've since had such a longing to connect outcasts and people that don't have kind of a family or a place. I've spent my whole life sort of building these little communities sort of accidentally, and he knew what he was doing. He was sort of showing me that's just that's who you are, but it comes out of this pain. So that, yes, middle school, high school can be awful.
Yeah.
And
Well,
certainly,
you raise, I think, a really interesting point. There's a guy that I know who is writing a book, and I'm very eager to read his book when it's done. His name is David Holmans. And David was kind of not to steal his thunder prematurely here, but I'm just like
yeah,
advertising, like
right,
read
yeah,
David Holman's book when it comes out. He's writing a book with a co-author about connectors and like
mm,
sort of the nature of what it means to be a connector and what is it that prompts people to sort of step into that role and to want to do that?
yeah,
Because a lot of people don't, right? It's sort of the anomalous person that really gets into it. And what he told me when I saw him earlier this year, that his research had uncovered, they interviewed like 50 people, and he said out of these interviews, like basically 49 out of the 50, their connected, their desire to be a connector was motivated by some kind of psychological wound that they were
uh,
essentially trying to salve and pay forward by helping other people, which I thought was kind of a wonderful way of doing it,
yeah.
but really interesting and perhaps apt.
Well, there you go. I should get that book. It always felt weird for me because I'm an introvert as well, and my whole life I've been on stage, basically, right?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
and connecting people, so it's fascinating uh, to think about how those early moments shape us for sure. I'm also I'm a big story theory guy, and I don't know how familiar you are with like Joseph Campbell's hero's journey and all that kind of stuff. But your story definitely starts off like any great story would, which is you're in your ordinary world and a longing to get out. So apart from pursuing education, was there a specific longing that you imagined? You're sitting in New York City now. Was that part of it when you're sitting in your small town? I'm going to be in New York someday. What were those early sort of, I guess, career ambitions or adventures you wanted to go on?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it didn't have to be New York,
Hmm.
although, New York could have been it. I remember like literally almost anything seemed more exciting
Hmm.
than
Yeah.
where I was in this little town. So yeah, I used to watch LA Law a lot. I thought that seemed very glamorous. Being a lawyer in Los Angeles, my God.
It's
It's
exactly
maybe
like that, but
yeah,
yeah.
I'm sure. I'm sure. Yeah, possibly the reality is not quite so sexy, but I thought that was really fantastic. And yeah, I mean all the different cities and opportunity. I was a big spy fan, a big James Bond fan, so
Hmm.
all the international intrigue was really great. But yeah, I felt a keen desire to be somewhere else, be in a place where things were happening, be in a place where I could kind of find my people, all of that.
So as we get back into your story, when does that start to happen? When do you sort of get an inkling of these might be my people, or start to feel that you're on the right adventure, to use that idea?
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, there was a very large immediate payoff, as a matter of fact, when I went to college, because literally when I was a prospective student, when I came up for the sort of initial overnight visit to like check out the place, I I met this girl who became my first girlfriend, and we completely hit it
Yeah.
off. And there was like no internet then. So in between February when I came up for the visit and August when I started for orientation, we wrote each other these long letters, and it was very exciting. And I get to campus and immediately we start dating, and also immediately I developed this like fantastic group of friends that are kind of, connected to her. And so it just immediately felt like,
Hmm.
oh, that's incredible. All I needed was just to sort of change my locale, and I can find people. And so it was really, wonderful,
That's good.
wondrous.
Yeah.
And that lasted probably for about a little over a semester. And then we broke up, and then all the friends kind of went with her, and so then it was like super depressing and lonely again.
Sure. Was that part, was your being part of the LGBTQ community, was that also part of the desire to get out of your town? Do you feel like was that all kind of connected for you, not feeling at home there?
Yeah, I would say it was. I mean, this is the old timey
Yeah,
days
right, right.
where people weren't on TikTok and things
Yeah.
like that. So I did not know any gay people. I had never
Yeah.
met any gay people. So you really did have to find like be geographically proactive in finding a community for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. Interesting. So it sounds like a lot of sort of, there's some pain in college with the breakup, but a lot of shaping you and some healing starts to happen, maybe and that call to adventure. So getting out of college, then when it came time to figure out, we all get to the point where we got to make some money, I guess. Like what were you thinking in terms of career and career path? What did you want to do, and where did that take you?
Well, really what I wanted to, I mean, I was such a fan of the college experience. I loved it so much. I thought it was so interesting, both, just the classes and the learning and the environment, like, the fancy buildings. I loved literally everything about it. So I was like, well, that's easy. I want to be a professor. And I was not, I was a little bit aware of kind of market forces, but not really, or not enough. I just figured, well, like, oh, it's going to be, challenging to get a job as like a professor in the humanities, but,
Yeah.
I will just be the best. And
Right.
therefore, the best will always do well.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the thinking. But as it happens, I was spared, you could say, from that fate, because I had gone to graduate school. I'd gotten a master's degree in theology, and then I wanted to go get my doctorate. And the original plan was I would get a doctorate in English literature, but kind of have a little bit of overlapping emphasis with religion,
Hmm.
and like religion and literature kind of thing. And anyway, no one wanted me. I applied to three places, and I got turned down by all of them. So I had to come up with a totally different plan. I had assumed I would get into at least one of them, and I did not.
Mm.
So yeah, the first iteration of my career goal was sort of a wash, and I had to start over.
The first kind of big, we talk about dragons that stand in our way, going back to the Joseph Campbell stuff. That those first perceived failures really tend to shape us as well. Um, and I think I told you this right before we talked. I also have a theology degree, so you can see where people end up when they get that. Just doing something else is it's kind of like an art degree a little bit, right?
That's
Yeah.
right. So did you get it like right after college, or
Mine
or did you go back and get it later?
mine was bachelor's, so it was like a Bible college. So that,
Mhm.
and then yeah, in my denomination, you went straight from that to leading a church, which was my early career. So that's what I did, and for various reasons, I don't do that anymore either. But it was a great experience. I think a lot of folks are drawn to that. As kids want to be world changers and want to know what the world's all about, and there's a draw to studying that for sure. I get it.
Yeah.
And then there's very limited jobs once you get out, unless you want to work at a church. Um, okay, so when that didn't work out, tell us a little bit about where you went next. What happened?
Yeah. So I had to kind of think quick, essentially, because this was like the spring, and I had planned that, okay, I'm gonna have this thing I'm gonna do in the fall, and I'm probably gonna have to move for it. Like,
Yeah.
I had sort of geared up for this reality, which was not happening. So I needed to figure something else out. So I actually feel like I did a reasonably good job of moving fast. I had to suddenly kind of do an inventory and say, okay, well, if academia is not going to be it, what is similar enough to academia that I could be happy with it?
Yeah.
So it's like, all right, what else involves reading and writing and ideas and talking to people, and so I came up with journalism and politics. So I signed myself up for two internships. One was to be an intern for a state rep, in my city, and the other was, so that was what I did for the fall semester, what would have
Hmm.
been the fall semester, and then for spring semester I did an internship at a magazine, and as a reporter. And I mean, they're small, like, intern kind of things, but you hang around, you meet people, you do stuff.
Yeah.
And eventually I was able to parlay that. As a journalist, you get so-called clips, which is like your little thing that you wrote that you get to show
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
And so I got some clips,
Nice.
and I was able to get a job at the local alternative weekly newspaper. So that became my first real ongoing job.
And you're in the process of becoming a better and better writer as you do that, I would assume. Um, the
Yeah, yeah.
maybe I'm jumping way ahead, but was The Long Game, was that your first book, or the first one that sort of took off? What's the story with that? It sounds fascinating, and I already ordered it, by the way. So
Oh, thank you very
yeah.
much. The long game actually, in a sort of meta move, no, it was not nearly the first one. It was
Okay.
my fourth book.
Okay.
So so yeah, my very first book that I wrote came out in 2013. That was called Reinventing You.
Okay.
And yeah, I uh the long game, the subtitle, which hopefully kind of sums it up, is how to be a long-term thinker in a short-term world.
Yeah.
And it basically talks about how we have to be strategically patient because things take a lot longer generally than we want them to. Sometimes some of those things include finding a career path.
Yep.
Some of those things include getting a best-selling book, because the long game, I feel very happy, made it to the Wall Street Journal bestseller list. But that was not the first book out of the gate. It took four to be able to build up enough knowledge and momentum to be able to crack that.
That's just the universe messing with you, right? Once she writes a book about patience, then all will be unleashed.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. The universe loves irony.
um, well, I'm curious. So obviously, those first three books were things trying to get out of you. When you look back at those, what was in you that you wanted to get out of those books? And I'm sure they resonated with many people, even though they weren't bestsellers.
Yeah, and I mean, for anyone who's not familiar with the process too, the sort of term bestseller it's a really specific thing.
Yeah.
People often assume it just means like, well, it sold well,
Right.
and that is true, but that is not a sort of full definition. It's not about how many copies you sell over the life of the book. It is how many copies you sell literally in a 1 week period, and whether that is enough to mount you at the top of a list, which of course depends on what else is released that
Yeah.
week or
Right.
how it compares to other things. So even if a book is really good, and even if it's actually objectively quite successful over time, it still may not be a bestseller. So it's an interesting nuance there. But broadly speaking, the first book about professional reinvention was something that I was able to write based on an article that I had written for the Harvard Business Review that had kind of taken off.
Hmm.
And in fact, interestingly, it was inspired in part by a lot of the early flailing that I had in my career. So,
Yeah.
often you're able to sort of take the lemons and make
Right.
lemonade.
Yeah.
And so for me, all the struggle of like finding a job and getting laid off and like all these things, um, inspired me to look into professional reinvention as a topic, and that turned into something, cool. My next two books were basically about problems that I personally wanted to solve, And so writing a book gave me a really good excuse to research them and attempt to solve them.
Yeah.
The first problem was about how to attempt to become a recognized expert in your field.
Hmm.
And so I wrote my book Stand Out based on that. And in my next book after that was trying to solve the problem of, okay, great. If you are recognized for your expertise, how do you actually make money from that?
Yeah.
And so it's a book about monetization called Entrepreneurial You.
Got you. Love that. And that, we'll talk about that a little bit. Let's, one of the things I think we live in a world now where almost everyone at least has the opportunity to sort of think of themselves. You hate to say it, as your own product or brand. And having, worked through all that stuff with your books, how do you think about, my first question is honestly about the health of thinking that way. Like, how do you, because I have to do it some myself, and you do, obviously, what do you find just emotionally, what are the guardrails to help someone kind of figure out how to make it through life, realizing part of what I'm selling is my name, is me, it's my thoughts, Does that make sense? What I'm asking?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's true, like a lot of things, right? I mean, it's very important for us to have a level of self-knowledge about what is triggering and what's not, what's a big deal and what's not. I mean, if you're somebody that has problems with overeating, if somebody next to you is eating potato chips, that is going to just like freak you out. Like you can't even concentrate because it's like, oh my God, the chips, right? Like somebody told me a story the other day about how this, they thought that somehow a person didn't like them. And the reason they thought the person didn't like them is that the person was sitting next to them and like moved across the room, which, I mean, okay, that's, perhaps not an unreasonable conclusion, but it was actually because that like this is a good life lesson, right? It's like the person saw that they were eating chips, thought the chips were too triggering, and moved across the room because of that.
Yeah.
So you never know what's going on.
Right.
So all this is to say, social media is a real trigger for some people. I have clients who have gone off social media because they just really found it too upsetting. Mm-hmm. It is not upsetting for me personally, but it is for some people, and that's a valid thing. It's just important to sort of know like what's the thing that gets you.
Yeah.
So, we have to. I think, the basic idea here is we can't opt out of, some basic things, right? Mm-hmm. If you want to be a successful business person, people do need to know about you. Yeah. They need to, hear about like, all right, well, what does he do or what does she do in some basic way? That's the basic. But there are a lot of ways you can do it. Mm-hmm. And so we can't opt out of the, the baseline, but we can opt out of certain methods of doing it. And just having the judgment to recognize that just because everyone else, quote unquote, is doing a certain thing doesn't mean you have to do it. We need to find our own way that is, something that we can still feel comfortable and feel like we have integrity in doing.
I love that. And I would be curious, what's interesting with, you seem like you're such a diverse person who's had a lot of experiences and a lot of interests. So I would wonder if it was hard for you to kind of narrow down what your expertise, what you wanted it to be or what it should be. For folks that may be at a place in their career listening to this, they have, we're all leaders, so we all have some sort of influence, and maybe influence is starting to grow outside of our own company. And people, if you're at that point where you really probably need to actually cognitively decide, this is what I want to be known for. Do you have some like life hacks or hints to kind of start that process when you realize, maybe it's time to do that?
Yeah, for sure, Joe. I mean, I like to think of it as there's a couple of kinds of people, right? I mean, there's the one group of people that it's just so clear what their expertise is, and they're just like, yes, I do blah, blah, blah. Right. And, they're all in on it. Mm-hmm. It's not even a question. And that's great. We're all jealous of those people.
I'm insanely jealous. That's what I was going to say. I'm so jealous of those people.
Yeah.
I hate that I'm kind of good at lots of things. That's so frustrating. Keep going.
Yeah. So you're exactly right. So, I mean, for this other group, which I would count myself in, and perhaps you too. Yeah. It's a lot harder because, you like a lot of things. You're decent at a lot of things. Like, you can take it in a lot of directions. And so it can become vexingly hard because you understand that life would be easier if you were to specialize or to somehow make a choice, but you kind of don't want to. And also, there's a lot of pressure in choosing that. Like, you don't want to choose wrong or whatever. And so, what I did, and I mean, it is true, you could just sort of make an arbitrary choice and go with it.
Yeah.
But what I did, which felt right for me, and I will share it in the hopes that it might be useful for other people, is literally I just let the market decide, because I realized I had no perspective. I did not have good enough judgment to understand what people were interested in. And I think that most people don't have good enough judgment to understand what the market really wants. I spent several years, like, this is not an overnight process. I spent several years creating a ton of content, writing a ton of articles, just putting things out there in a variety of areas. And it was only through seeing what took off that helped me hone my direction. Now, of course, I became more interested in a topic once I saw that people wanted to hear more about it. So it wasn't inauthentic. It was something I was interested in, but that got accelerated by the fact that I'm like, oh, people like this. Oh, okay, cool. Let's do more of it. So for me, it really was the case of like writing this HBR article about professional reinvention, seeing that that was a thing, and then saying like, all right, I'm gonna ride this train.
Yeah.
And that led downstream to a lot of different opportunities. How has it been for you?
Thanks for asking. It's similar, for my story. It's the theme. What's been consistent, I realized, was I've always been a storyteller. In one form or another. They've just been pretty dramatically different forms. So I tend to fall back on that, but I also have a huge improv background, and improvisation is highly shaping me into how I work. So the combination of kind of story and improv is probably what I'm most known for. I did do a TEDx talk like 9 years ago on being a failure, which was well received. So for for 3 years, I did keynotes on being a failure until my ego just couldn't take it anymore. I'm like, I don't want to be known as the failure forever. But those things, but also what you're saying, because I'm entrepreneur as well. So I've been able to lead companies where it's not all just about me. So I think, and maybe you can talk to this some as well, there are lots of folks like me that, I've had opportunities through my life where I probably could have been a solo entrepreneur and just really focused on speaking or writing or something like that. But I always enjoy the idea of building a company with people around me and having people smarter than me in the room and all that. So for me, there is sort of always a little bit of tension in that my personal brand helps my business, but sometimes they work hand in glove, and other times it's kind of a little confusing, which one gets the attention. Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah, it does.
Thanks for you're turning the chairs on me, asking me questions. I do appreciate that.
Inquiring minds want to know, man.
That's right.
Thank you. It's great. It's great to hear your perspective.
Thank you. Let's get to the long game, because I think it relates to all this. But so that is the book that sort of took off. So in your mind, there it is.
We get a prop. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, the simple question is why do you think it caught on maybe a little quicker than the others? What is it about it?
So I would attribute it to 3 factors. The first one, and perhaps the simplest one to replicate, is actually some advice that I got from a colleague named Rory Vaden. And he just said something that makes sense, obviously, but I had never heard it formulated this way before, and it just really resonated with me, which is that he said, when you are titling a book, what you need to do is make sure that you come up with a title such that when people hear the title, they say, I want that. And I think a lot of us fail to do that, just at a really basic level. Something that I think is wrong, quote unquote, with my book Stand Out, which I think is actually a really excellent book. But the truth is, a lot of people feel highly ambivalent about the idea of even standing out. Why would you want to buy a book for a thing that you don't even know if you want to do? Because people have like self-esteem issues or whatever. It's like, oh, I probably should have done that differently in retrospect. And in fact, later this year, the book is coming out again in the UK. There's a UK reissue of the book under a different title called Unapologetically You, which I think will probably be better.
Yeah.
But The Long Game, How to Be a Long-Term Thinker in a Short-Term World, I think is a very appealing title because people are like, oh, yes, that sounds like a good idea.
Yeah.
How can I do that? So, having a thing where people say, I want that is very powerful. That's number one. And then number 2 and 3 kind of tie together. The number 2, I'll just say, actually is a function of having done the previous books, in that if your goal is to hit a bestseller list, which means you have to sell a ton of copies, thousands and thousands of copies all at once in the first week, you need to have a really big list. You need to have a big following of people. And that is something that if you're, kind of parachuting in from some other field, like if you're already a celebrity or something like that, you probably can do it. But if you are a quote unquote regular person, you kind of need a lot of time to build that up. Yeah. So it's a lot easier on the fourth one than the first one because people have joined your mailing list. They've, subscribed to your, your YouTube channel or whatever it is. So more people know about you and you can reach them. So that's just a function of time. And the third is that this book, unlike my previous book, Entrepreneurial You, which was aimed more at individuals, this book, The Long Game, had, just to use the marketing terminology, it had both B2B and B2C appeal. So meaning businesses liked it, B2B is business to business, and individuals liked it, B2C being consumer. And so you just have a bigger market for it. A regular person who's like a subscriber to your newsletter might say, oh, that's cool, I'll buy it. But it was also equally possible that someone who runs a company would say, oh, well, I'm going to buy this for 10 of my team members, or I'm going to buy this for, 300 of our employees. And when you're able to drive sales in that way, it's a lot easier to rack up sales. So those are sort of the 3 things that I would say are probably the core reasons why The Long Game has been especially successful.
I'm glad you've really thought it through. Someone's asked you that before, I feel like.
I mean, not specifically, but I do think about these. I come from a marketing background, so I think about these things all the time.
Yeah. Unbelievably, we're almost out of time, which makes me sad. So we'll have you back on, or maybe we can find a way to hang out some other way sometime. You have such an infectious spirit, and you're very fun to talk to. So thank you so much. Before we leave, I got to ask, what's going on with the musical? Tell me about this. What can you tell me? What's it about?
Oh, absolutely. Well, in fact, in The Long Game, one of the stories that I tell, because it is sort of an exemplification of this, there's this sort of famous saying that we overestimate what we can accomplish in a day, but we underestimate what we can accomplish in a year. Mm-hmm. And my contention is that is exponentially true if we think, okay, what can I accomplish in 10 years? Yeah. So in 2016, I created a 10-year goal for myself that I would write a musical that made it to Broadway. And the tricky part of this is I had never written a musical before, and I did not know how to write a musical. But I figured, 10 years, I can do that. Yeah. So I'm now 7 years in. So I'm actually literally just kind of living the experience in real time for people to see as kind of a test case. So I write about it in The Long Game. And as the most recent update, 7 years in, my musical is now complete. I mean, you always tweak a little bit, but it is essentially a complete musical. And just a few days ago, we had a couple of Actors Equity staged readings with professional actors that was presented by an off-Broadway theater in New York. So we are moving it forward. It's a lesbian spy musical, and I'm very excited about it.
I mean, can you save me 2 seats for opening night? I'll fly to New York.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want you there.
Perfect. I'm in. That sounds fun. I can't wait to see it. I'll see it at the Tony Awards in 12 years then. So that'll be great. Shoot high. Thanks so much. It was such an honor to meet you, and we look forward to having you around on our platform more. If you'll be back, that would be awesome.
I would love to be back. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks.